I'm Femi OK, and this is The Stream.
And I'm Malika Bilal. Today, whistleblowers. Why do they risk it all? We speak with author Tom Mueller, whose new book answers that question.
And we want to hear from you. You can tweet us at ajstream or leave a comment in our live YouTube chat, and you'll also be in The Stream.
Hi, my name is Catherine Gunn, and I am the whistleblower that was featured in the film The Official Secrets, and you are in The Stream.
From Wall Street to Washington, whistleblowers are speaking truth to power. The most recent high-profile case has sparked an impeachment inquiry into United States President Donald Trump's dealings with Ukraine. But what makes some people choose to speak out about wrongdoing while others remain silent?
Joining us to discuss this in Washington, D.C., Tom Mueller, author of Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. Thomas Drake, a former intelligence analyst at the National Security Agency who blew the whistle on the agency's controversial surveillance program. He lives in the US, but is joining us from Melbourne, Australia. And in our studio, Baklid-Kunz. She is a corporate whistleblower who worked as a compliance officer at Halifax Health Systems in Florida for 20 years. You'll hear her story in just a moment. Hello, everybody. It's good to have you here. Tom, this book, it's not a small book. Let me just show it to people how big it is. You spoke to so many whistleblowers as you were getting this entire book together. How did you do that? How did you sit down and put their stories together so that we get a really good sense of why people whistleblow and what happens to them?
I began by looking at one corner of whistleblowing, a False Claims Act whistleblowing, which is corporate fraud. And gradually, as I talked with the people, I began to get a sense of the sorts of people that do this in that area. And then I began to realize that actually this is not just an island, this is a continent of whistleblowing. And I looked at other corporate whistleblowers, then I looked at government whistleblowers, then I looked at national security whistleblowers. And in each and every case, the personal dynamics of their decision to act and the group dynamics of the group around them, the toxic group doing illegality that retaliated against them, was very, very similar. So there became a kind of a whistleblower character that emerged from my work.
All right. What is a whistleblower character, would you say, Ellen?
Someone who is willing to risk everything to do the right thing. I think that's one of the things in the whistleblowers I have talked to, that's our common thread, I think. We're not willing to be silenced when we see something is wrong. And that's what we hope everyone would want to do.
Can you tell us the moment where you saw something wrong, where you thought, I have to do something about this?
So in my particular case, I was a healthcare whistleblower, and we had contracts with physicians that violated the Stark Law, which is supposed to make sure physicians are admitting patients or doing clinical care for the right reasons and not for financial reasons. So when our hospital, I was director of physician services, and we violated the Stark Law, and then realized that the hospital, after telling them they were aware of it, then they decided to pay anyway. Then I realized that, you know, I had to tell someone or I would be complicit to that fraud.
And just to be clear, surgeries were done, medical practices were done that were unnecessary, so they were being done for money.
Yes, so those were alleged allegations. Part of that case settled, so it didn't go to court where, you know, so they're still considered alleged, yes. So that's what happens in settlements, is not everything gets litigated and become public, which is part of the hard thing. Even though it settles for a lot of money, you don't know if it's corrected.
Right, right.
Ellen, your story reminds me of a video comment we got from someone else who talks about the reason that she had to do it. This is Sheila White, a whistleblower for an employment discrimination case. And here's what she sent to the stream.
The reason I chose to be a whistleblower for the unfair treatment and retaliation in the workplace, and I speak out for the ones who can't speak out for themselves. I am proud to be a whistleblower. Thanks.
So Tom, that line, I spoke out for people who couldn't speak out for themselves, paraphrasing her there a little bit. Is that something you see as a theme, kind of a thread through the people that you've talked to over the course of this book?
Absolutely. She put in words exactly, almost word for word, but what another whistleblower whose case I looked into, Alan Jones, who blew the whistle both on Johnson & Johnson and major pharmaceutical companies and his own office, the Inspector General of Pennsylvania, for serious multi-state billion-dollar wrongdoing. He said, I must speak out for those who are silent. I must speak out for the people who are victims, who have no voice. He used exactly the same terminology. That's a kind of person who thinks about society and everyone in society as equal members and equal members of the human race.
Back in 2015, AJ Plus did a very special interactive. There were videos, there were interviews, all about Thomas Drake and what he did at the NSA. Have a look here on my laptop, because I just want to show you the very beginning of it. It's very dramatic. Have a look here on my laptop. There you go. And then I am going to press play.
It's fair to say that if there hadn't been a Thomas Drake, there couldn't have been an Edward Snowden. Here we had a guy who did absolutely everything right. He placed his faith in the system. He saw, the warrantless wiretapping of hundreds of millions of Americans. He saw corruption. He brought it to the IG. He brought it to the Congress. And rather than protecting him, they actively retaliated against him.
Thomas, that moment when you realized you had to do something, what does that feel like as an emotion, as somebody who's working in an organization where you realize something has gone horribly wrong?
Well, in my case, my first day on the job, reporting to my new duty station, which was the number 3 person at NSA, the Signals Intelligence Directorate, I quickly found out what my government was doing in secret, under the cover of the failure to keep almost 3,000 people out of harm's way. And they did so under the blanket of national security. And when you say, what does it feel like? You don't wake up one morning and say, hey, I'm going to become a whistleblower. But you're confronted by the stark reality of something gone terribly wrong. And it was simply the case I could not remain silent, because if I had remained silent, I would have been complicit, not only in the wrongdoing, but in this case, a violation of the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, and privacy rights of millions of people at the highest levels of the government, up to and including the president. But I knew that by doing so, I was looking over a cliff. And my life was never going to be the same again.
Sure. And I have to say, the clip that I just played, of course, if anybody didn't recognize that person, was Edward Snowden, when the whole NSA whistleblowing, actually, it literally blew up, but you were there before he was there, so you paved the way. Malika, where do you want to go to next?
This tweet from Mark, who says, whistleblowers should always be given a right to undertake their activities. Appropriate laws should be in place to protect them and the information that they have obtained. So someone else in our community wrote back, this is Media BX, who says there is, at least in the United States, the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989 that was enacted to protect federal employees, but it doesn't seem so efficient. Whistleblowers feel lonely, isolated, and paranoid that they could be targeted in the streets by anyone seeking retribution. Thomas, for you, were you thinking of the legal protections you might have? What was going through your mind, the ramifications of what the law might offer you?
Well, my eyes are wide open. I was certainly not naive. I had been serving the government in the past a number of times. And, here I was as a senior executive. There were existing channels. They call them disclosure channels. They're supposed to be protected against retaliation, but they're really exposure channels. You're reporting on wrongdoing and violations of law committed by the highest levels of your own agency, and in my case, not just the agency, but also the White House, the President of the United States, the Vice President, the head of the National Security Agency. They're not going to take too kindly to having someone, even as senior as I was, having them be exposed, and so they're going to retaliate. The problem is that these laws, although they say, and I was under the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act, also later with the Department of Defense IG's Act, it's supposed to protect you, but there's nothing to protect you against retaliation. And you are left extraordinarily exposed.
Ellen, go ahead.
So in my particular case, my case is filed under the False Claims Act, which also has a protection for retaliation. And in my experience, that's on paper, because unless you're willing to file a lawsuit against the retaliation, your work is going to tell you it's perceived anytime you have a complaint. So I don't think they work well, at least not in my instance.
Tom, go ahead.
If I could jump in, just to a little context, let's remember that Thomas Drake was a multi-decade servant of our nation. And someone who had proven his patriotism time and time again. He came forward under the specific guarantee of anonymity. He spoke out through channels that were carefully laid out, legally protected in theory. But in practice, of course, it went from a whistleblower protection to a whistleblower trap. And both of these people are people who simply cannot remain silent while this is happening. They have a greater loyalty and a greater sense of duty than to their individual bosses or to their teams. They have a higher calling, if you will, and that calling cannot be silenced. And both of them have said to me at one time or another, Thomas said to me at one time, well, I had to look myself in the mirror every day. I had to do what I did. Ellen calls her choice a choiceless choice. I had to be able to put my kids to bed at night, and I couldn't if I had not spoken up. So essentially, these are people with a conscience, an individual conscience, that forces them to act. And thank God that they exist.
Tom, you mentioned something interesting that I want to pick up on. You said the anonymity, and there are people in our community that are talking about that point, the named whistleblowers versus the unnamed. So on YouTube, someone writing in live, Hemo says, the real whistleblowers are the ones you never hear about. So that's one person's view. Another person writing to us on Twitter, also picking up on that point, Ao says, if you blow a whistle on me, I have every right to see you. Tom, what's your take on that view and anonymous whistleblowing versus named whistleblowing?
Well, first of all, many legal regimes, many laws guarantee anonymity. So that last statement is nonsense. This is simply not true. The ideal world scenario is for a whistleblower not to be named, because when they come forward and lose their anonymity, that is quite often a career suicide. We're looking at two people highly qualified, extremely ethical, extremely able, who will never work again in their chosen fields. And that is 99% of the cases that I looked at in my book, 99% at least, never work again. This is a big problem. So anonymity is not only an important principle under the law, but it's also a guarantee of future well-being for these people. As Edward Snowden himself said, we should not expect people to commit career suicide in order to come forward. We'll run out of people who will do the right thing.
Thomas, go ahead. You had a thought about anonymity. Go ahead.
Well, remember, I'm only public because a government indicted me under the Espionage Act. That's the only reason I became known. Now, I was certainly retaliated against within the system, but I was anonymous in terms of what is on paper, but there is no protection against retaliation. There's no access to the courts. In my case, especially as an intelligence community and former employee, it's a very secret space. And so, although I was anonymous, because of what I was blowing the whistle on, which was at the highest levels of the government, they were going to do everything they could to punish me. And in my case, I knew, because I was very familiar with the Daniel Ellsberg from the Pentagon Papers history, that I could face not just the loss of my job, I could face a lot worse. And I did ultimately go to the press with unclassified information regarding what I knew in the public interest. But the idea that a whistleblower coming forward, whoever is, remember, it was a reasonable belief. You have to remember the standard is a reasonable belief that you actually have seen a wrongdoing or a violation of the law, and you're coming forward to disclose that. It doesn't necessarily mean you were an eyewitness. I was an eyewitness, but I also had others who remain anonymous to this day, and I will continue to protect for the rest of my life, that also shared critical information with me regarding what was going on. So I reported all of that.
Right.
But it's really important to note, it's not like there's no court you go to, right? But then, the in essence, the accuser, right? That's why I get to face my accuser. You're hearing that right now from, President Trump. He wants to flush out the whistleblower. I mean, the most dangerous thing that can happen is when the whistleblower is actually exposed by name. And the reason is that they want the focus to be on the messenger, and they want to avoid having to deal with the message. So now you kill the messenger. You attack the messenger. You would take out the messenger, and you don't have to deal with the actual whistleblowing itself. You only focus on the whistleblower. I never wanted to be public. I never wanted to have my name sprayed across the front pages of multiple newspapers and magazines and be in the style section and have profiles made of me. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, going from a private citizen who is doing their job, providing for the common defense silently, but behind secret walls, doing my job, and then finding myself, being fully exposed. Life was never and is never the same again. Now, is there a silver lining? Yes, I get to come on shows like yours and talk about all this. But that's, the whistleblowers, it's a love-hate relationship in terms of the history. And I think Tom's book really goes into great detail about, it's not just the price you pay, but a lot of the critical changes, critical events in history across multiple sectors in society, the changes that were made for the good, for safety, well-being, keeping government accountable, was because of the risk that whistleblowers took, knowing that their lives could very well not be the same.
Thomas, I hear you, and I hear you repeat that your life will never be the same again. You talk about retaliation. Ellen, I want you to give us some very descriptive ideas of what happened to you in terms of the retaliation, because bizarrely, it often seems that the whistleblower is the person that's pointed as the demon in this, the bad guy or the bad woman, but you're trying to help. What happened to you? What was the retaliation like?
So in my particular case, under the False Claims Act, the seal was lifted in 1 year. So I filed under seal where no one knew that it was me. And I hope that when the seal was lifted, the case would be close to over.
And if I may, and you can correct me if I'm legally wrong, it means that then investigations can happen. No one knows.
Yes.
The organization you work for, they don't know that the investigation is happening.
Exactly.
So that it can proceed, and then suddenly you've got all that evidence, and then you can.
Yes, and typically the cases I had looked at under the false claims, the whistleblower got to stay anonymous till the end of the case.
Right.
Not for my case. It unsealed in 1 year, and I worked there for 4.5 years after that when everyone knew it was me.
So what happened to you? What happened?
I went from a perfect, I went from perfect evaluation to 0 scores on leadership. The worst part that happened to me was that even my friends were retaliated against and told that they couldn't even go to lunch with me. And that is harder than any personal retaliation, because you have protection in the end versus your friends have no protection. And when the case was over, some of them lost their jobs. And of course, they weren't fired. Their jobs were just changed. Their job description changed to where they no longer, qualified for the job they'd had for 20 years or something like that. So retaliation is brutal.
And yet, you won your case. Do you feel that people often look at you and say, well, there's a success story?
Yes, and they call it a success story because there is a settlement and you get a reward.
Yeah.
However, what people don't realize is that very few cases the whistleblower ends up with a financial reward. And in my particular case, it's considered successful because I did. However, I believe less than 20% of these False Claims Act cases, the whistleblower ends up with anything at all, so you risk your job knowing that you may not get anything.
I'm just going to
That's a very, very important point to the numbers of people who actually succeed through the many, many cases that I looked at in various different industries who actually get any sort of a payout at all are extremely low. And let's remember, this is not some sort of a bounty. This is essentially a payment for your lost career. You will never work again. So to call it a bounty and to make it look like this person is trying to win the lottery or game the system, it's actually very wrong-headed. But I think something that Thomas said earlier is very apropos to our current situation. When we start personalizing whistleblowers, when we start saying who are they and what is their background, what's their history, what's their favorite color, we deflect from the facts that they bring forward. Do they have good facts or not? In the current case, with President Trump and the Ukraine whistleblowers, because there's a body, this is a community of whistleblowers coming forward. It reminded me very much of Thomas's case, where a group of loyal and long-term, multi-decade servants in the NSA and out came forward with a very specific complaint. And the channels that they followed were the legal channels, did not serve them well. And I'm wondering how he thinks, does he feel this is a replay of history when he watches the Ukraine whistleblowers?
Well, no, I've had many flashbacks as a result of this. And, separate from partisanship and the politics, whistleblowers are like back in the news again, right? And this is a good whistleblower, and I think part simply because of just the extraordinary conduct and behavior of a president in office who's now clearly obstructing justice and is just projecting left and right each and every day, and through his social media and his Twitter accounts, in particular. Yes, I mean, I certainly can identify what the risks are, especially when you're taking on the President of the United States, just like I did. I mean, you don't do that without some kind of retribution. You don't do that knowing that there won't be some kind of reprisal. I mean, there are that particular whistleblower, now we have others that apparently have come forward. They're not only is their career at risk, there have been direct threats issued against at least the first one. I myself, I mean, I don't talk about it publicly. I mean, I realize I'm here on AJ, but I myself had threats that were issued. I had, the government was making all kinds of veiled comments, right, to even fellow workers.
Thomas, do you mind? I don't want to trigger you, but we're spending the whole show talking about this, so I know you're prepared for this. What kind of veiled threat, just very briefly, because we're almost at the end of the show, did you get from the government? What would they say to you to scare you?
Well, in my case, the retaliation was, I ended up losing my job. They call it lateral arrest. Right. I got to the point where I had no programs, I had no people, and I just had an office and a computer. The handwriting was on the wall. Right. The threats actually came later because of what the government ended up doing. Remember, I was part of a criminal leak investigation. Right. And so you have the Department of Justice that's on your back at the highest levels, considering you to be an insider threat. That's what it became. The threat was I was now an insider threat and I had to be removed.
I think hearing about those threats is so important because you're not alone in that. I want to play a video comment from someone else. This is Jane Turner. She's a FBI whistleblower and also a 25-year veteran, a special agent with the FBI. Here's the aftermath of her case.
My name is Jane Turner, and I am an FBI whistleblower. My 20-year legal battle with the FBI has resulted in financial ruin, pain for my family, and loss of a career. Although adjudicated a whistleblower 4 years ago by the Department of Justice, the FBI has refused to honor the judgment. It has been a devastating journey for someone with a moral compass and integrity.
Tom, that must echo other things that you heard from others. In the end, what did they tell you about those repercussions? Absolutely.
The range of retaliation is so visceral, so the emotions that come out are so charged that we're clearly dealing with deep, almost tribal emotions. I mean, the ritual humiliation in front of others, the stripping of security clearances. You have security guards marching people out of the door, threats against their lives in some cases, and people following them, surveillance. At the end of the day, though, these people, and I'm honored to be on a show with two of my heroes and the other people that I wrote about, they didn't have a choice. They fundamentally, when push came to shove and everyone else looked the other way, they said, no, I must do this. And I am thankful to them and to their colleagues.
Tom is the author of Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. It is currently available in all good bookshops and, of course, online. Thank you, Tom, Thomas, and Ellen, for joining us today. Malika.
Khalid, here is where I'll end. While the rest of us become complicit in our silence, he writes, whistleblowers are the heroic citizens and the models we must emulate.
Thank you for watching, everybody. Malika and I will see you online next time.